Hi there, and welcome to the Daily Gardener, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It's March 25th. Today we celebrate the man remembered as the father of plant anatomy. We'll also learn about a man who developed his own system of classifying plant families, and then we'll chat a little bit about why knowing your plant families can be a beneficial skill to add to your gardening expertise. We'll hear a little poem today from an English writer who was born on this day. She led an incredible life. And we'll grow that garden library today with a book about a great topic, plant folklore. And then we'll wrap things up with a little story about one of my favorite spring ephemerals, violets. Well, before we get to all of that, I want to take a second and give a shout out to the people who have left a review for the show over on Podchaser. That means so much to me because I set a goal at the beginning of the year to get 50 reviews on Podchaser, and I'm halfway there. So thank you so much for doing that. I want to specifically recognize Leo Presnell. Leo wrote, "If you love gardening the way I do, then you'll love the Daily Gardener podcast. Not only do you get a ton of knowledge regarding gardening, that's kind of hard to say, but history and biographical and personal information about famed botanists, past and present. Jennifer's calm and positive voice is akin to sitting down with a friend out on the patio and discussing the subject that you both love." Well, thank you so much, Leo, for writing that. I feel the same way when I'm putting the show together. I keep you all top of mind, and I just imagine that you're right here with me as I'm putting the show together. And then Heidi Bertels also shared a great review. She wrote, "A wonderfully peaceful way to start a day. Interesting garden facts with history thrown in. The transition music is unique and relaxing, and it's a very nice listen with a cup of coffee." Well, Heidi, I have my cup of coffee right here, and I'm cheersing you from afar. So thank you for that review. I really appreciate it. And then listener Tracy Carnes left a review for the show. She wrote, "This daily podcast is full of inspiring information about all things gardening, plants, gardens, gardeners, and books. I look forward to it each weekday." Well, Tracy, I want to thank you for that review. And for those of you listening, you may not be aware, but Tracy reached out in December because she had discovered the show when she was searching for information about her ancestor online. And so she reached out and contacted me in the Facebook group for the show. And she wrote, "I just found your lovely podcast, and when I listened in it, I noticed that you shared about botanical history, and I wondered if you'd ever discussed my fourth great-grandfather, John Goldie. I was so happy to see that you had on your July 23rd episode. He was married to Margaret Smith, which made him the son-in-law of James Smith of Scotland. His gravesite declares him the father of Scottish botany. Now, I didn't find a post about James Smith on your website. Maybe a future topic. Thank you for your interesting gardening podcast and website." Well, I thought it was tremendously exciting to connect with a fourth great-granddaughter of John Goldie and a fifth great-granddaughter of James Smith. And while I did not feature James on my January 1st episode, I did just write about him in my garden history book that I'm writing. And since Tracy first reached out, we've been able to connect a few times by phone. And I know I shared with her and a few other listeners that I've managed to connect with by phone that I often do ancestry research on some of these botanists because some, as I'm researching them, have no known birthday or death date. And so those are two dates that are important to me since my show show is so date driven. So if I find a botanist that I want to profile on the show and they don't seem to have a recorded birth date or death date, I will create a tree for them on Ancestry, an entire family tree, and then see if I can't find a birth record, a baptism record, or a death record so that I can feature them on the show. And in the case of James Smith, Tracy's fifth great grandfather, who was the father of Scottish botany, we have a death date of January 1st, but we do not know his exact birth date. That information has been lost to us. And with the way the holidays fall, I generally don't do a January 1st show. But I think what I will do is when I talk about John Goldie next, I will mention James Smith because James Smith hired his future son-in-law, the botanist John Goldie, to work in his Monkwood garden. So what I especially love about that little story is you get both botany and family history all rolled in to one botanical profile. All right, and then next up is a review from Sarah Marie Cudahy. Sarah wrote, I love this podcast. It's full of useful and practical information as well as historical facts that I likely would not have unearthed myself. I enjoy Jennifer's soft and lovely tone, like a conversation with a gardening friend, and I felt particularly connected to today's episode, the woman who was in the flower shop during World War II. And she is right. Flowers make one feel normal. And so all during this year, as I have focused on my own little urban vegetable and cut flower garden, bulb planting, bulb forcing, seed planting, and seed starting, all of these things were so I too could be doing normal things during an abnormal time. I may just make a sign for my garden that reminds me of this. This is a must subscribe if you're a gardener of any level. Well, Sarah, your review actually made me choke up a little bit. I especially enjoy when a listener connects to something that I'm sharing with them, especially if it's an excerpt from a book or a garden poem. Those things are always very near and dear to my heart. That's why I feature them on the show. And what Sarah is referring to here is a little excerpt that I shared from Sue Shepard's book about the surprising life of Constance Spry. Constance, of course, had a flower shop, and in case you didn't hear it, this excerpt was shared on the episode for March 16th, and the gist of it is that Constance Spry, the great floral designer, she had a flower shop in London during World War II. She walks into her flower shop one morning after a bomb just exploded very nearby the shop, and so the fire department came, and there's water all over the floor of her shop because they were putting out the fire that was nearby. All the windows in this flower shop had been blown out. And this customer shows up in the morning, and so does Constance Spry. And so the staff is there, and they give this customer her flowers, and they're talking to her. They're all gathering around. And as the woman goes to leave, the people in the shop say, hey, we're sorry for the mess. We're sorry for this disaster that you walked into here. And the woman doesn't even bat an eye. Instead, she's just looking down at these beautiful flowers that she just bought, and she says, that flowers make a person feel normal. And so that's what resonated with Sarah that day. And that resonated deeply with me as well. I was thinking along the same lines as you, Sarah. And so I'm so glad that you found that connection with the show. And it was very touching to me that you wrote about that in your review of the podcast. In any case, I have gone on way too long about Podchaser and all of these wonderful reviews, but I wanted to take a second and share them with you today. And also to make an appeal that if you have any time in your day and you appreciate the Daily Gardener podcast, if you wouldn't mind heading on over to Podchaser and leaving a review of the show. And so all you need to do is go to podchaser.com. It's two words that they smush together. And then when you get there, just search for the Daily Gardener and then click to leave a review. And then I'll be sure to see it. And I will definitely thank you in the Facebook group for the show and then also on air, because I want to properly thank you for helping me reach my goal of 50 reviews. All right, enough of that. It's time for today's curated news. Boy, I must have been in a bit of a reflective mood this week because the post that I selected for today is actually kind of a throwback. It's regarding 2019, and it says the top 10 best botanical discoveries in 2019. Now, I loved reading this post because I don't know about you, but I feel like the last year or so has been a bit of a blur, almost like a time warp. And so for me, looking back at all of these wonderful botanical discoveries was really quite fascinating. Some of them I did remember, and some of them I either knew about and forgot or I never heard about. Now, what I thought I would do is just do a quick rundown. And then if you want to read about any of these in more detail, you can follow up with this post later when it works for you. So the first one was a new species of shrub that was discovered in a protected mountain area between Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And it's really quite beautiful. The flowers have a little bit of a waxy appearance. They kind of remind me of a Hoya blossom, and they're in the crux of the branches there. So you'll have to check that out. The second discovery was finding the secrets of indigenous tribes through experimental botany. And here, scientists have shown that growing certain types of crops could provide huge harvests for the tribes that are cultivating them. And this is important because there are so many people looking at how to solve hunger, especially as the population on the planet continues to grow. Number 3 was a species of bush from South Africa that was thought to be extinct. It was rediscovered by a student. I love these stories when young people are getting involved in botany and making a big difference. Number 4 is the secret of making traps. This one I did remember. This was a study that showed how carnivorous plants form traps. And there's also a great video to go along with that one. Number 5 was all about oxygen and the way that plants are using oxygen species to guide root growth. This was very plant geeky, but very, very interesting. Number 6 was all about protective armor for seeds. And this one is all about plant innovation. Researchers have developed this seed coating that would help seeds grow in less fertile soils. Number 7 was a favorite of mine. It was all about how plants can be good elders for their young. And so here what they're talking about is how plants relate to one another. And this was a study that came out of Spain and England, and I remember reading about it. And what it did is it showed that plants were shown to interact and support younger seedlings, basically encouraging them along. So one plant helping another. Number 8 was pectin as an aluminum armor. So this one is out of Japan, and this is a study that showed how plants protect themselves from aluminum poisoning. Okay, we're in the home stretch. We have 2 left. Number 9 was all about fungi and how they are using special proteins that protect them from plant immunity. Fungi live as plant parasites in many cases, and so they have figured out a way to adapt to how the plant will react to them, and they basically try to get around the immune system of plants. So that one was also very fascinating. And then last but not least was this story about danger that's happening to an iconic plant, and it's all about the Hawaiian silver swords. And I know I've talked about this on the show as well before, and the impact that drought is having on this deeply loved plant in Hawaii. All right, so there is the list. I think almost all of these have corresponding videos and great text, great bullet points outlining each of them. So as I went through this list, if anything piqued your interest, make sure that you follow up with this post in the Facebook group for the show, because I will post a link to it there. And all you need to do is search for the word botany, and this post will pop up. It'll be one of the top search results, and you can click on it there. The title again is Top 10 Best Botany Discoveries in 2019, the year that definitely changed the world. And it's good to know that we also had some good things happening in botany as well. Now, if you're not in the Facebook group for the show and you'd like to have access to all of the articles, I should say easy access to all of the articles that I curate for you on the show, all you need to do is join the Facebook group that I've created for listeners. It's a private group, and it is very easy to join. The next time you're in Facebook, just type in Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend, and then request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. It's time for today's botanical history. Here's botanical history for today, March 25th. Today is the birthday of the father of plant anatomy, Nehemiah Grew, who was born on this day, March 25th, in 1641. Nehemiah was an English botanist, and he was the first person to illustrate the inner structures and functions of plants in all their amazing intricacies. Specifically, Nehemiah illustrated 80 images in his 1682 book called Anatomy of Plants, which was divided into 4 topics: anatomy of vegetables begun, anatomy of roots, anatomy of trunks, and anatomy of leaves, flowers, fruits, and seeds. He covered all the bases. Nehemiah was one of the first naturalists to incorporate the microscope in the study of plant morphology. Nehemiah's unique perspective is what he tried to recreate in his drawings. He wanted to share what he was seeing through the lens of the microscope. So, for instance, Nehemiah's drawings of tree parts cut transversely look like intricate laser cuts. And if you've ever seen a Nehemiah Grew drawing, you'll probably agree that you can spot them a mile away. But if you've never seen a Nehemiah Grew drawing, then imagine a mandala or an Etch-a-Sketch drawing on steroids. The lines in Nehemiah's drawings are impossibly thin, and the level of detail is staggering. Nehemiah's use of the microscope allowed him to write about plants intimately, and he was the first person to give a detailed description of pollen, and he was able to do that because he was looking at it under the microscope. Now, as you might imagine, Nehemiah's obsession with the microscope expanded into almost all areas of his life. He was looking at everything he could under the microscope. He was having fun with it. So it's not surprising to learn that Nehemiah was also the first person to look at the human hand and foot under the microscope. Now, if you've ever looked at your hands or your fingers under a magnifying glass, maybe if you had a splinter or something like that, Just how fascinating it can be to look at our skin, to look at the ridges and the patterns that make up our skin. And this was fascinating to Nehemiah as well. And so he published incredibly accurate drawings of finger ridge patterns, essentially fingerprints, way back in 1684. And so I always like to joke that palm readers owe Nehemiah Grew a debt of gratitude. Just kidding. Or am I? Now, if you'd like to try something fun this summer, you can channel your inner Nehemiah Grew and get a microscope. Go get one of them on Amazon, or better yet, at a thrift store. I run across these all the time. And I also want to make you aware that Goodwill offers online shopping. So if you've never done that before, just Google Goodwill online shopping, and that will pop up, and then you can experiment with that. But that's how I acquired my microscope, and I think I got it for around $20 or $30 on that particular website. And so I say, why not add that to your garden toolkit this year? You can bring in plant specimens, and you can look at them under the microscope. And this would be especially fun to do if you have little gardeners running around the house. You just may ignite the spark inside a young botanist. And today is the birthday of the German botanist Adolf Engler, who was born on this day, March 25th in 1844. Now, we remember Adolf because he developed a system for plant classification that's now called the Engler system, and it's still used in some specialty areas today. In fact, some herbariums still organize their specimens using the Engler system. Now, Engler wrote a masterpiece called Die Natürlichen Pflanzenfamilien. I love when I get a chance to use my German on the show, and that translates to the natural plant families. That's the book that Engler wrote, and that's the book that he is best remembered for. And now I want to take a second and talk about this concept of plant families because it is so useful for gardeners to understand. If you're a new gardener, it's important to know that plant families can help you with plant identification because once you know the characteristics of plants within a family, you can begin to narrow down your plant ID options. For instance, once you know that the common daisy is in the Asteraceae family, then whenever you see a plant that looks like a daisy, you can bet pretty accurately that that plant is probably part of the Asteraceae family. And here's another example. Flowers in the Campanulaceae family are often bell or star-shaped, and they're generally blue. And here's another good tip to keep in mind when we're talking about plant families. All the plants in a plant family tend to have similar seed structure or shape. So you might notice that plants in the cabbage or Brassicaceae family have little paper-thin membranes that divide the two halves of the seed pod. And finally, plant families can often have similarities when it comes to the seedlings and how the seedlings grow. So, for instance, you have monocot families like the iris and the lily, and they will have seedlings that will have a single leaf, while dicot families have two little seed leaves on their seedlings. It's time for Unearthed Words. Today's unearthed words are by the English romantic novelist and poet Mary Webb, who was born on this day, March 25th, in 1881. And she has an incredible life story. So if you get a chance, you really should check out Mary Gladys Webb. And so for today, to honor Mary, to remember her, I selected her poem, Green Rain. It's a beautiful little poem about the natural world in spring. Here's Green Rain by Mary Webb. Into the scented woods we'll go and see the blackthorn swim in snow. High above in the budding leaves, a brooding dove awakes and grieves. The glades with mingled music stir, and wildly laughs the woodpecker. When blackthorn petals pearl the breeze, there are the twisted hawthorn trees, thick set with buds, as clear and pale as golden water or green hail. As if a storm of rain had stood, enchanted in the thorny wood, and hearing fairy voices call, hung poised, forgetting how to fall. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Folklore and Symbolism of Flowers, Plants, and Trees by Ernst Lehner and Johanna Lehner. This book came out in 2003. It's an oldie but goodie, and I agree with how the publisher of this book describes it. They say this profusely illustrated archive of more than 200 flowers, plants, and trees was compiled by Ernst and Johanna Lehner, and they happen to be two of the world's foremost collectors of pictorial symbols. How's that for a job? And they also happen to be devoted flower enthusiasts. So that's a wonderful mashup. Now, I love diving in to the meaning of flowers, to florography, and taking a look at the symbolism of flowers. And what Ernst and Johanna do in this book is that they really look at all aspects of these flowers, plants, and trees. They look at the religious meaning, they look at the legends that have evolved around these plants, and they also examine how these plants have been used as symbols through time. So if you have any interest in this topic, this book is a must-have. This book is 128 pages of the religious, legendary, and symbolic meaning of 200 plants. You can get a copy of Folklore and Symbolism of Flowers, Plants, and Trees by Ernst Lehner and Johanna Lehner using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $10. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day, March 25th, in 1874, that the English merchant and author Henry Arthur Bright recorded an update about his spring garden in his famous book called A Year in a Lancashire Garden. And I love that I have an original copy of this book, and it is so fun to look through every now and then and see what Henry was experiencing. And I thought you would get a kick out of this particular entry, what he wrote for this day back in 1874. Again, we have had frost and snow, and this time it has done us harm. The early bloom of the apricot has turned black, and our chance of a crop rests with the later buds. Meanwhile, the white scilla, the double daffodil, the arabis, and some others are doing well enough. A bed of daisies and other polyanthus are far from satisfactory. Hepaticas I have tried over and over again, and they always fail. By the way, I found it very difficult to get these primroses and had to pay what seemed an excessive price for them. We have violets in abundance, and they scent all the air as we pass through the garden door. Even in winter, a faint fragrance lingers among their leaves, a shadowy memory of a perfume which haunts them even when no single flower can be found. Bacon says that the flower which above all others yields the sweetest smell in the air is the violet, especially the double white violet, which comes twice a year, about the middle of April and about Bartholomew Tide, or August 24th. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. Hey, thanks for spending part of your day with The Daily Gardener. If you want to read even more botanical brevities, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. That's where you can find all the stories, biographies, and books that I share on the show. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. It has lots of goodies in it, and I try to make the newsletter like you're getting a marvelous letter from a garden friend. You can always find The Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media. You can follow the show on Twitter, and you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can easily share your gardener greetings or book submissions by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove in Wyoming, Minnesota, with the help of Paige Mance, Brooke Bierbaum, and Eric Begay. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.